Aviation cadets were being groomed to fly warplanes of a unit which was then a unit in thought only, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. These men were pioneers of a venture so new that you who stand here before me now, after 3 years, may still be considered forerunners in the movement which has given you a place in the fighting men of the sky.
When you hear about the Tuskegee Airmen or see a P-51 fighter plane with its tail painted red, you might think that's the only aircraft they flew. The first black pilots in American military history flew more than single-engine, single-seat fighter planes. Tuskegee pilots also flew twin-engine bombers. These were bigger aircraft with a flight crew of 4 to 6 members. But the bomber crews faced a different battle than the fighter pilots. 4 squadrons of Tuskegee-trained pilots formed the 332nd Fighter Group. They flew P-51 Mustangs to escort bombers and attack ground targets. The squadrons flew from bases in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. The first enemy aircraft claimed by a Tuskegee Airman happened on July 2nd, 1943, when a member of the 99th Fighter Squadron downed a Focke-Wulf 190, the most effective Luftwaffe fighter of the war. The pilot was First Lieutenant Charles Blakesley Hall from Brazil, Indiana. Their training started at an airfield near the Tuskegee Institute. Training black civilian pilots began there before the war. The region enjoyed good flying weather much of the time. Another reason for selecting Tuskegee for training was because the area presented a segregated environment. This was in step with the Army's segregated training policies of those times. Daniel Hallman of the Air Force Historical Research Agency wrote that one of Franklin Roosevelt's promises during his campaign for a third term as U.S. president was creating opportunities for black pilots in military aviation. The War Department followed through in 1941, but their training and unit assignments were segregated. He also wrote that white officers were the first commanders of flying units composed of black pilots. The first black officers to command came later. The most famous of them was Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr. He was a West Point graduate and later became the first black general in the Air Force. When Colonel Davis took command, the 99th Fighter Squadron had become part of the 332nd Fighter Group and was based in Italy. The 332nd logged a total of 112 enemy aircraft destroyed. 3 of these were the Germans' jet-powered Me-262, making these Tuskegee Airmen among the few Allied pilots to take their propeller-driven P-51s up against the Luftwaffe's high-performance fighter. The German pilots that took notice of their combat skills, giving them the nickname the Black Birdmen. The pilots of 332nd got another nickname, the Red Tails, because the tails of some of their planes were painted red. By the end of the war in Europe, they flew 1,800 combat missions, consisting of 15,533 sorties. In June 1943, when Colonel Davis assumed command, the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bomber Group were combined into the 477th Composite Group. He was assigned the task untangling the problems facing the 477th, problems that began from the day the Bomber Group was activated. Understanding how they came to be starts and ends with the tensions around policies of segregation. Those tensions reached a breaking point when the Bomber Group was stationed in Indiana. The Army Air Force organized a bomber unit in mid-1943 called the 477th Bombardment Group. This group consisted of black flight crews and ground support teams. They were assigned the B-25, a twin-engine, medium-weight bomber. Designed by North American Aviation, over 9,800 B-25s were built for World War II duty. The aircraft is perhaps best known for the Doolittle raid on Japan. The raid happened in April of 1942, when 16 B-25s launched from the Hornet aircraft carrier. The B-25 endeared herself to flight crews for her safe, forgiving handling in the air and her sturdy build. The aircraft could take a tremendous beating and keep flying, even with one engine out. What crews complained about was the high noise level inside the plane. The B-25 was so hard on the ears of its pilots that many suffered some hearing loss. Despite the flight crews of the 477th Bombardment Group having an airplane to meet their combat needs, they never got the chance to fly in any combat theater. Reports published about the 477th mentioned the indifference of the group's white officers who used their postings for moving to higher ranks. Consequently, one report said the 477th represented segregation at its worst. The 477th moved from airbase to airbase, never receiving enough classroom time for training the flight crews, splitting squadrons among different airfields. For example, they were moved from MacDill Field in Florida to Godman Field in Kentucky, then 2 airfields in Indiana, Freeman Field near Seymour and Atterbury Field near Columbus. The reason for 2 fields was that Freeman had the facilities for housing the unit, but its ramps and runways were too small for the B-25 bombers they flew. The unit's aircraft were based at Atterbury. They were in the Hoosier State for a single month, but it was long enough to make history. What became known as the Freeman Field Mutiny symbolized unit commander Colonel Robert Selway's disregard of the War Department's regulations forbidding segregation of public spaces. That included Freeman Field's Officers Club. It was here the officers of the 477th took a stand. Faced with separate and unequal facilities, the officers presented themselves at the White Officers Club on April 5th, 1945. They were denied entry, but brushed past the white officer on duty to get inside the club. A publication issued by the National Park Service in 2016 said that over 60 officers of the 477th were arrested the next night for attempting to enter the White Officers Club. In response, Colonel Selway issued an order assigning officers to clubs by race. He went further to include segregation of housing and dining halls. He then demanded black officers sign statements agreeing to the order. Over 100 officers of the 477th refused to sign the statement, amounting to a refusal to obey an order from a superior officer. In time of war, it was an offense punishable by death. These officers were placed under arrest, transferred back to Godman Field in Kentucky, and held under armed guard. Godman Field also held German prisoners of war. Just as the Germans had noticed the flying skills of the Red Tails over Europe, they noticed the treatment these officers received in their own country. The German officers of war were quick to ask, "Why are you fighting for a country that doesn't want you?" Testimonials from black service members in World War II convey their understanding of a double consciousness, that is, the duty to serve their country, while knowing their service would not provide them with full access to society back home due to Jim Crow segregation. The Double V campaign, which meant victory at home and abroad, promoted the fight for democracy overseas and at home for black veterans returning from the war. News of Selway's orders, the arrest of officers from the 477th, and subsequent charges spread through the press, labor unions, and Congress. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall eventually ordered the release of the officers, but this wasn't the end. Colonel Selway lost his command and was replaced by Colonel Benjamin Davis. The Army brass judged him as the right man to lead a force that combined the fighter and bomber groups into the 477th Composite Group. In late May 1945, Army Air Force Commanding General Henry Arnold replaced the white officer group over the 477th with black officers commanded by Colonel Davis. Plans were made to send the B-25 group and the fighters at Godman Field to the Pacific to fight the war against Japan. But the war in the Pacific ended before they could deploy. It took until 1995 for removal of letters of reprimand placed in the personnel files of some officers, following the charges being dropped in their cases. Others were removed upon request, and a pardon issued for one officer whose case went to trial. The Tuskegee Airmen received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007 in recognition of their unique military record, which inspired revolutionary reform in the armed forces. In the end, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen has many chapters, with only 2 described here. First, the fighter group, who flew into history as the Red Tails. They were fierce defenders of Allied bombers against enemy aircraft and potent destroyers of enemy ground positions. Second, the bomber groups, who waged a successful battle against racial indifference and segregation. The Tuskegee Airmen overcame the harshness of racism in the military by exhibiting bravery and courage during times of great peril. Their actions gained them the respect of military and political leadership and their fellow service members. Air Force historian Daniel Hallman summed up their contributions this way: the Tuskegee Airmen fought 2 enemies, the Nazis overseas and racism at home, and truly fought so that others would be free.